No one wants to date me, mister, she said on a blind date. Then the single dad's reaction changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Caleb Morrison sat in a corner booth at Riverside Bistro in downtown Portland on March the 15th at 6:30 in the evening, nervously shredding his paper napkin into tiny pieces, while trying to remember the last time he'd been on an actual date. And the answer was approximately 3 years and 2 months ago with his wife Jenna before she died in a car accident that turned his entire world upside down. His sister Brooke had set this whole thing up with some nurse who worked at the same hospital as her friend, and she'd spent 2 weeks basically harassing him with texts saying, "You need to move on, Caleb. Ava needs to see you happy. Just one date, and if it's terrible, you never have to do it again." Until he'd finally caved just to get her off his back. The thing about being a widower at 36 years old with a 6-year-old daughter who has severe facial burn scars is that dating feels impossible and selfish and terrifying all at the same time. Because how do you explain to a stranger that your kid accidentally pulled a pot of boiling water off the stove 2 years ago and spent 4 months in the hospital getting skin, grafts, and surgeries, and that she still has 17 more procedures to go, and that she comes home from first grade crying because kids call her a monster? Caleb checked his phone for the fifth time in 10 minutes and saw a text from Ava's babysitter saying, "She's fine. Stop worrying. Go have fun," with a smiley face emoji. And he tried to remember what fun even felt like anymore, when most of his life was construction sites and hospital waiting rooms and parent-teacher conferences, where he had to advocate for his daughter's right to not be bullied. He was about to text Brooke and make up some excuse about a work emergency when a woman walked through the restaurant doors looking absolutely panicked, and she was scanning the room, clearly searching for someone, and Caleb recognized her from the photo his sister had shown him. She was wearing a long-sleeve burgundy blouse even though it was a relatively warm March evening, and the collar came up high on her neck, and her dark blonde hair was down covering the sides of her face, and she looked like she was preparing for battle instead of a casual dinner date. Laura spotted him and took this visible deep breath like she was gathering every ounce of courage she had, and she walked over to his booth with her hands twisting together in front of her. And Caleb stood up because his mama had raised him right and stuck out his hand to shake hers. When their hands connected, he felt her fingers trembling, and as she pulled back, her sleeve rode up just a couple of inches, and Caleb saw the edge of what looked like burn scarring on her wrist and forearm, the kind of textured, discolored skin he'd become intimately familiar with over the past 2 years sitting in hospital rooms with Ava. His eyes flicked up to her neck, where the collar didn't quite cover everything, and he saw more scarring there. And Laura caught him looking, and her entire face just crumpled, and she sat down in the booth across from him like all the air had gone out of her body. They sat in awkward silence for about 30 seconds while Laura picked up the menu and then set it back down without looking at it. And her hands were shaking so badly Caleb could see the menu vibrating. And then she looked directly at him and said in this quiet but firm voice, "I need to say something before we waste each other's time here." Caleb said, "Okay." And Laura reached down and deliberately pushed her left sleeve all the way up to her elbow, and the scarring was extensive, thick and textured and clearly from burns, and it covered her entire forearm and disappeared up under the fabric. She turned her head to the side and pulled her hair back, showing her neck, and the scarring continued there too, and she said, "8 years ago, I was in a house fire that killed both my parents. These scars cover my left shoulder and arm and neck and parts of my back. I've had multiple surgeries and I'll have more. And I need you to know that I've been on exactly 2 dates since this happened, and both men were perfectly polite during dinner, but I never heard from either of them again." Her voice cracked on the last few words and she was looking down at the table instead of at him, and she said, "No one wants to date me, Mr. Morrison, so if you want to leave right now or make up an excuse about a family emergency or something, I completely understand and I won't be offended. I just thought it was better to be upfront about it so we don't waste time pretending." The way she said Mr. Morrison was so formal and defensive, like she was putting up a wall between them before he could reject her first. And Caleb felt his heart absolutely shatter for this woman sitting across from him who was so used to being turned away that she'd started doing it to herself. He didn't say anything for about 5 seconds, and he could see Laura bracing herself like she was waiting for the blow. And then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone and unlocked it. And Laura's face did this thing, where she clearly thought he was checking the time so he could plan his escape. Caleb turned the phone around and showed her his lock screen, which was a photo of Ava from last month, and she was smiling at the camera, but the burn scars were clearly visible on her right cheek and neck and jawline. And he said, "This is my daughter Ava. She's 6 years old, and 2 years ago when she was 4, she pulled a pot of boiling water off the stove while I was at a construction site, and my mom was supposed to be watching her." Laura's eyes went wide and filled with tears immediately, and Caleb kept talking, because if he stopped, he was going to start crying too. She had second and third degree burns over 15% of her body. She spent 4 months in the hospital. She's had 17 surgeries so far, with more scheduled, and she tells me every single night when I tuck her in that she's ugly and that no one will ever love her because of her face. His voice cracked hard on the word face, and he had to clear his throat, and he looked Laura straight in the eyes and said, "You are the most beautiful thing I've seen in 3 years. Not despite your scars, but because those scars mean you survived. You fought, you won. You're sitting here in front of me, and that takes more courage than anything." Laura completely broke down, just put her face in her hands and started sobbing right there in the middle of the restaurant. And Caleb slid out of his side of the booth and into hers without even thinking about it. And he put his arm around her shoulders while she cried. She was saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to fall apart." And Caleb said, "Don't apologize. You just told a complete stranger your biggest vulnerability, and I just told you mine. I think we're allowed to cry about it." They sat like that for probably 2 full minutes while other diners pretended not to stare. And when Laura finally caught her breath, she looked up at him with mascara running down her face and said, "No one has ever said anything like that to me, ever. In 8 years, no one has called me beautiful." Caleb grabbed a napkin from the dispenser and handed it to her, and he said, "Then you've been talking to the wrong people. Those scars mean you're a survivor, a warrior, and that's the most beautiful thing a person can be." They ended up talking for the next 3 hours straight, completely forgetting to order food until the waitress came by for the third time and they realized they were starving. Laura told him about the house fire that killed her parents when she was 24, about the year of recovery and surgeries, about how she'd been working in marketing before the fire, but decided to become a nurse after because she wanted to help people the way the nurses had helped her, and she worked in the pediatric ward, now specializing in burn patients. Caleb told her about Jenna dying 3 years ago in a car accident that came out of nowhere, about raising Ava alone while running a small construction crew, about the guilt he still carried from not being home when Ava's accident happened, and about how his daughter had gone from being the most confident, outgoing 4-year-old to a shy, withdrawn 6-year-old who hid behind her hair and thought she was a monster. At 10 o'clock, when the restaurant was getting ready to close, they finally walked out to the parking lot, and Caleb said something that surprised even himself. "This is going to sound absolutely insane because we literally just met, but would you be willing to meet Ava?" Laura stopped walking and turned to look at him like he'd grown a second head, and she said, "What? Like already we've known each other for 3 hours." And Caleb said, "I know it's fast, but she needs to meet someone like you, someone who has burn scars and survived and built a whole life. She thinks her scars make her unlovable, and you could show her that's not true." Laura's face went through about 5 different emotions and she said, "I'm not good with kids. I mean, I'm a pediatric nurse, but that's different. What if I say the wrong thing and make it worse for her?" And Caleb could tell she was lying about not being good with kids. She was just terrified of disappointing his daughter. He said, "Please, not as my girlfriend or my date or anything like that. Just as someone who understands what she's going through in a way I never can. Just meet her once. And if it's weird or uncomfortable, we never have to do it again." Laura looked at him for a long time and her eyes were wet again. And finally she said, "Okay, yes, when were you thinking?" And Caleb said, "Tomorrow Sunday, we could meet at the park. Low pressure, just the three of us." And Laura nodded even though she looked absolutely terrified. That night Laura stood in her bathroom at home staring at herself in the mirror, and she took off her shirt and looked at the full extent of the scarring that covered her shoulder in upper back and arm and neck. Scars she hadn't let anyone see fully in 8 years. And she started crying again, thinking, what if seeing me makes that little girl feel worse? What if I scare her? What if I'm not what she needs? Meanwhile, Caleb was tucking Ava into bed and she said, Daddy, did you have fun on your date tonight? And Caleb said, yeah, sweetheart, I actually did. And I met someone really special that I want you to meet tomorrow. And Ava sat straight up in bed with her eyes wide and said, a new mommy? Caleb said, no, baby, just someone who has scars like you do from a fire. And she's really brave, and I think you'd like her. And Ava got very quiet for a minute before she said in the smallest voice, is she pretty even with her scars? And Caleb felt his heart break all over again. And he said, she's beautiful inside and out. And so are you, baby girl. So are you. The next morning at 11 o'clock, Laura sat on a bench at Laurelhurst Park wearing long sleeves even though it was a warm Sunday in March. And she was about 15 minutes early because she was so nervous she couldn't sit at home anymore. And she kept rehearsing in her head what she'd say to a 6-year-old with burned scars without accidentally making everything worse. She saw Caleb walking across the grass, holding hands with a little girl who had long, dark hair covering the right side of her face, and the kid was wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up, even though it was almost 70 degrees outside. And Laura's heart absolutely shattered because she recognized that attempt to hide, that desperate need to make yourself invisible that she'd felt for years. Caleb waved when he spotted her, and Ava kept her head down looking at her shoes. And when they got close, Caleb said, Ava, this is Laura. Laura, this is my daughter. And Ava barely glanced up and mumbled, hi, so quietly Laura almost didn't hear it. The three of them stood there in awkward silence for about 10 seconds, and Laura could feel herself starting to panic because she had no idea what to do. And then she knelt down so she was at Ava's eye level and said, your dad told me you like to draw. Is that true? And Ava nodded just a tiny bit without looking up. Laura said, I'm actually really terrible at drawing. Like stick figures are about my limit. Do you think maybe you could teach me how to do it better? And Ava peeked up through her hair with one eye visible and said, really, you want me to teach you? In this surprised little voice like no adult had ever asked her to teach them anything. They walked over to a picnic table, and Caleb pulled out a bag of crayons and paper he'd brought, and Ava started drawing while Laura sat next to her, and very deliberately Laura pushed up both her sleeves, showing the scarring on her arms, fully without saying a single word about it, just letting Ava see. For about 20 minutes they drew together, and Ava kept sneaking glances at Laura's scars. And finally, in this whisper that barely counted as sound, Ava said, does it hurt? And Laura said, not anymore. It hurt a lot when it first happened, and for a long time after, but now it doesn't hurt at all. It's just part of me. Ava touched her own face through her hair, tracing the scarring under the curtain of dark strands, and said, mine still hurts sometimes, especially when it's cold or when I touch it too much. And Laura said, that makes total sense, sweetie. You're still healing. Your body's still doing its work. It gets easier, I promise. Ava was quiet for another minute, and then she said in the smallest, most heartbreaking voice Laura had ever heard, kids at school say I'm ugly. They say I look like a monster. And Laura felt tears spring to her eyes immediately. She reached up and pulled her hair back from her neck, showing the scarring there fully, and she said, kids used to say that about me too when I was younger, and sometimes adults still think it even if they don't say it out loud. But you know what I learned? Ava shook her head and Laura said, scars mean we survived something really hard, something that could have killed us but didn't. That makes us warriors, and not everyone gets to say they're a warrior. Ava looked up fully for the first time and slowly pushed her hair back from her face, and the scarring was visible on her cheek and neck and jawline, red and textured and still healing. And she said, am I really a warrior? And Laura was crying openly now and said, you're the strongest warrior I've ever met. And Ava just launched herself at Laura and hugged her tight around the neck. Caleb was standing about 10 feet away, pretending to look at his phone, but actually watching them. And he had to turn around completely because he was crying too hard to hide it. Over the next 3 months, Laura and Ava became completely inseparable. They had their Sunday park dates every single week without fail, And slowly Ava started opening up and wearing her hair back and even agreeing to go to the public pool with Laura in June, which was massive because it meant wearing a swimsuit that showed her scars. The first time they went swimming together, Ava stared at Laura's scars covering her shoulder and back and said, "You're not scared for people to see?" And Laura said, "I used to be terrified. I hid for 8 years, but I got tired of hiding. I wanted to live my life, and that meant letting people see all of me." And Ava reached out and held Laura's scarred hand with her own scarred one and said, "We match." Caleb and Laura had been dating slowly and carefully the whole time, always making sure Ava was comfortable and never pushing too fast. And in May on Laura's porch after Ava had fallen asleep during a movie night, Caleb kissed her for the first time. He pulled back and said, "I'm falling for you, like really falling, and that scares me because I haven't felt this way since Jenna." And Laura said, "I'm absolutely terrified because I keep waiting for you to realize you could do so much better than me." And Caleb kissed her again harder and said, "There is no better than you. You're it for me." In June, Laura invited Caleb to come see the hospital where she worked, and she took him through the pediatric burn unit where both she and Ava had been treated years apart. And she said, "This is where I spent a year of my life learning to be human again. After I recovered, I couldn't go back to my marketing job. It felt meaningless. I needed to help kids who were going through what I went through." She showed him the teen support group she ran for burn survivors, and Caleb watched her work with a 15-year-old girl who had facial burns, teaching her makeup techniques and confidence building, and the girl was crying and laughing and hugging Laura. And Caleb realized this woman wasn't just his girlfriend. She was exactly what Ava needed to become whole again. Everything got complicated on the 4th of July at Caleb's family barbecue when his sister Brooke pulled him aside while Laura was playing cornhole with Ava and said, "She's really great, Caleb. But are you totally sure about this? About bringing someone so damaged into Ava's life?" Caleb felt anger flash hot in his chest and said, "Damaged? She's the strongest person I've ever known. What are you talking about?" And Brooke said, "I just mean Ava's already been through so much trauma. What if this doesn't work out between you two? Another loss could completely destroy her." Caleb said, "Laura's not going anywhere." But Brooke planted the seed of doubt when she said, "How can you possibly know that you've only known her 4 months? What if she decides this is too much? What if she can't handle being a stepmom to a kid with special needs?" That night, Caleb was distant and quiet, and Laura noticed immediately and assumed it was about her scars or her inadequacy, and she started pulling back emotionally to protect herself from the rejection she was sure was coming. 2 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, Ava woke up screaming with a fever of 103, and the scar tissue on her neck was bright red and inflamed and hot to the touch. And Caleb completely panicked because it looked exactly like it had right after the original accident. He called Laura in the middle of the night, and she was at his house in 15 minutes, still in her pajamas. And she assessed Ava quickly and calmly and said, "It's an infection in the scar tissue. It's actually pretty common. She needs antibiotics, but we don't need the ER yet. I have supplies in my car." Laura stayed up the entire night monitoring Ava's fever and administering medication and keeping her comfortable. And by morning, Ava was stable and sleeping peacefully with Laura in a chair next to her bed holding her hand. Caleb found them like that at 6 a.m. and just stood in the doorway, watching. And he realized with absolute clarity that this was his family. This was what he wanted for the rest of his life. 3 days later, when Ava was fully recovered, she was drawing at the kitchen table while Caleb made dinner, and she said without looking up from her paper, "Daddy, can Laura be my new mommy?" And Caleb dropped the spoon he was holding, and it clattered loudly on the floor. He said, "What, sweetie?" And Ava looked up at him with those big serious eyes and said, "I want Laura to be my mommy. She makes you smile like you used to smile in the pictures with Mom. And she makes me feel brave. She understands my scars, and she doesn't think I'm ugly or scary. Can she stay with us forever?" That night after Ava went to bed, Caleb asked Laura to stay. And when she looked panicked, thinking he was about to break up with her, he said, "Ava asked if you could be her mom." And Laura stopped breathing completely. Caleb took both her hands and said, "And I realize I want that too. I'm not asking you to marry me right this second, but I'm asking, will you be part of this family officially? Will you move in with us and help me raise Ava and be the person she needs and the person I need? Laura was crying so hard she couldn't speak, and finally she said, I never thought anyone would want me like this. Want all of me. And Caleb said, I want every single piece of you, the scars and the strength and everything in between. And Laura said, yes, yes, I want to be your family. In August, Laura moved into Caleb's house with 2 suitcases and about a million insecurities that she was going to somehow mess this up. And Ava helped her unpack every single item like it was Christmas morning, hanging Laura's clothes in the closet next to Caleb's, and arranging her books on the shelves and declaring that Laura's bathroom products made the whole house smell better. They fell into routines that felt natural and right. Family dinners where Ava talked nonstop about her day, bedtime stories where Laura did all the character voices, school drop-offs where Laura braided Ava's hair and never once suggested she use it to hide her face anymore. In September, Laura started something called the Warrior Program at the hospital, a mentorship initiative that paired kids with burn injuries with adult survivors who'd built successful lives. And Ava, at 6 years old, became the youngest mentor for a 4-year-old girl who'd just come out of her first round of surgeries. Caleb watched his daughter sit with this tiny kid, showing her the scars on her own face and saying, see, I have them too. We're both warriors, and warriors are brave. And he had to leave the room because he was crying too hard to stay. The local news picked up the story in October and did a whole segment called Nurse Creates Hope for Burn Survivors. And they interviewed Laura on camera with her scars fully visible, talking about empowerment and healing and how scars don't define you, they refine you. Caleb watched the broadcast from his living room with Ava curled up next to him. And when Laura's face filled the screen, talking about her journey from hiding for 8 years to running a mentorship program, he couldn't stop the tears from running down his face because he was so incredibly proud of this woman. His sister Brooke called him right after the segment aired and said, I was completely wrong about her. She's not damaged. She's incredible. I'm sorry I ever made you doubt this. And Caleb said, yeah, she really is incredible. I'm glad you finally see it. Without any bitterness because Brooke had come around, and that's what mattered. On December 20th, exactly 9 months to the day after their first date, Caleb told Laura he needed her to come to the hospital for a volunteer shift, and she thought it was just a normal Sunday with the support group, but when she walked into the pediatric burn unit, it was decorated with Christmas lights, and every single kid she'd mentored over the past year was standing there holding signs. The signs spelled out, Will you marry our Caleb? And Ava was at the end, holding the final sign that said, And be my real mommy? And Laura's hands flew to her mouth, and she started sobbing before she even turned around. Caleb was down on one knee in the middle of the hospital ward, surrounded by doctors and nurses and families. And he said, Laura Hayes, you taught my daughter that scars make us warriors instead of victims. You taught me that beauty isn't about what you look like. It's about what you survive. And I cannot imagine spending one more day of my life without you. Will you marry me? Will you make this official and be Ava's mom and my wife? Laura couldn't even form words. She was crying so hard, so she just nodded over and over, and Ava came running and crashed into both of them, and they had this 3-person group hug while the entire burn unit applauded and cried. They got married the following June on a perfect sunny Saturday afternoon in an outdoor garden venue with about 50 people. And Ava was the flower girl wearing a sleeveless dress she'd picked out herself that showed her scars proudly. And when Laura walked down the aisle, Caleb actually gasped out loud. She was wearing a sleeveless wedding dress, her arms and shoulders and neck scars fully visible for the first time in 8 years in front of this many people. And she was shaking, but her head was held high, and she'd never looked more beautiful. Caleb was crying before she even reached him, and when she got to the front, he whispered, You're stunning, and Laura whispered back, I'm terrified, but I'm done hiding. Their vows destroyed every single person in attendance. Caleb said, You showed us that scars aren't weaknesses, they're proof of strength. You saved my daughter's spirit, and you saved my heart, and I promise to spend every day reminding you how beautiful you are. And Laura said, I spent 8 years thinking I was unlovable. You taught me I was just waiting for people who see souls instead of skin. You and Ava are my miracle, and I'm never letting you go. Ava did a reading she'd written herself, A poem about warriors who love each other and make families out of broken pieces. And there wasn't a dry eye anywhere when she finished. The first dance was all three of them together because they were a unit now, a family built on scars and survival and fierce love. And all of Laura's burn survivor support group teenagers were there because they were her family too. 2 years later, Laura and Caleb had a baby boy who was now 1 year old, and Ava at 9 years old was the most protective big sister on the planet. And the four of them showed up at the hospital on a Sunday for Laura's support group. A new girl arrived. She was about 14 with burn scars on her face and arms, and she had her hood pulled up and her head down, and she mumbled, "No one's ever going to want me. I'm hideous," in this broken voice that made Laura's heart shatter into a million pieces. Laura knelt down next to her and pushed up her sleeves, showing her scars fully, and she said, "I said those exact words 8 years ago. I believed it with everything I had, and I was completely wrong." She pointed across the room to where Caleb was holding their baby, and Ava was making funny faces to make her little brother laugh. And she said, "The right person doesn't see scars. They see strength. They see survival. They see beauty in places other people are too shallow to look." The girl looked up slowly and saw Laura's scars and then saw her family. And she said, "You're married, you have kids, you have a whole life?" And Laura said, "Two kids and a husband who tells me I'm beautiful every single day, and he means it because I am beautiful. And so are you. You're here, you survived, you're a warrior." The girl started crying, and Laura pulled her into a hug. And Caleb watched from across the room, still completely in awe of his wife after all this time. That night, after both kids were asleep, Laura and Caleb sat on their front porch with glasses of wine. And Laura said, "Do you remember our first date when I told you no one wants to date me?" And Caleb said, "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met, just sitting there, showing me your scars and daring me to reject you." Laura touched her arm, running her fingers over the scarring, and said, "I used to hate these so much. I spent 8 years hiding them and hating myself. But now when I look at them, I think about everything they brought me." Caleb took her hand and kissed her scarred knuckles and said, "They brought you to me and Ava. They made you into the incredible person you are. I wouldn't change a single thing about you." And Laura leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "I never thought I'd have this. A family, a husband who loves me, kids who think I'm beautiful. I spent so long thinking I was too broken." And Caleb said, "You were never broken, baby. You were just healing. And now you're helping other people heal too." Sometimes the thing you think makes you unlovable is exactly what leads you to the deepest love. Laura spent 8 years believing her scars made her unwanted and undateable. And Caleb was raising a daughter who thought the exact same thing about herself. One blind date, one brutally honest confession, one construction worker dad who saw beauty in survival instead of damage, and 3 lives changed completely forever. Scars aren't flaws. They're proof that you fought and you won. They're evidence of survival and strength and refusing to give up when everything hurt. The right person doesn't see damage when they look at you. They see a warrior. They see someone who went through hell and came out the other side still standing. If you've ever felt too broken or too scarred or too different to be loved, if you've ever hidden parts of yourself because you thought they made you unworthy, you're wrong. You're so wrong it hurts. Your scars, whether they're physical or emotional or invisible, don't define you. They refine you. They make you into someone who understands pain and survival and the absolute miracle of still being here. There's someone out there looking for exactly what you think makes you unlovable. Looking for a warrior who's been through fire and came out stronger. Laura found her family by being brave enough to show her scars on a first date, by being honest about her fear of rejection. And Caleb found healing for himself and his daughter by seeing beauty where others saw damage. Hit that subscribe button if this story reminded you that beauty comes in all forms and real love sees past the surface to the soul underneath. And share this with someone who needs to know that their scars don't make them less. They make them warriors. Thanks so much for being here with us today. And remember, you are exactly enough, exactly as you are. Your person is out there, and they're going to love every single piece of you, including the parts you've been hiding.